Picture this. You've trained since you were 7 years old. 15 years of brutal discipline. You've mastered the sword, the lance, horseback combat. You've spent a fortune on armor, custom-fitted steel plates that took a master craftsman months to forge. You are nobility. You are a knight. You are, by every measure of the past 5 centuries, the apex predator of the battlefield. And then a peasant farmer, given a metal tube and 2 weeks of training, shoots you in the face from 100 yards away. This is the Renaissance. And if you're a knight, you're living through the death of everything your world stood for. Today, we're going into the brutal, chaotic reality of what it meant to be a knight during the Renaissance period, roughly 1400 to 1600. This isn't the shining age of chivalry you've seen in movies. This is the era when knights realized their entire way of life was becoming obsolete, and most of them refused to accept it until it was far too late. To understand what Renaissance knights went through, we need to understand what they expected their lives to be. If you were born into a noble family in 1450, your path was already decided. At age 7, you'd be sent away from home to serve as a page in another lord's household. Not a servant, a student. You'd learn courtly manners, how to serve at table, basic horsemanship, and you'd start your weapons training. This wasn't gentle. Pages were beaten for mistakes, pushed to physical exhaustion, taught that weakness was unacceptable. You'd wake before dawn, spend hours practicing with wooden swords until your hands bled, then spend the rest of the day serving at meals, caring for horses, running messages between nobles. Your childhood was over the moment you entered that castle gate. You were being forged into something harder than the steel you'd eventually wear. At 14, you'd become a squire. This is where things got serious. You'd be assigned to a specific knight, and you'd become his shadow. You'd maintain his armor, care for his horses, carry his weapons, but more importantly, you'd train with him every single day. Sword work until your arms felt like lead. Lance charges until you could thread a needle from horseback. Wrestling, because if you got knocked off your horse, you needed to fight in 60 pounds of steel. The training was designed to be overwhelming. A squire's day started at dawn with prayers, then moved to weapons practice. You'd drill with the sword for 2 hours. Cuts, thrusts, parries, footwork. Then you'd move to mounted combat, charging at targets with a lance while your master shouted corrections. Then wrestling and hand-to-hand fighting. Then back to the sword, but this time in partial armor to build strength. Your muscles would scream. You'd collapse at night too exhausted to think. And this wasn't occasional training. This was every day for 7 years. No vacations, no breaks. You were being programmed, turned into a weapon. The idea was that when battle came, you wouldn't think, you'd react. Your body would know what to do because it had done it 10,000 times before. At 21, if you'd proven yourself, you'd be knighted. It was a religious ceremony. You'd fast, pray through the night, take a ritual bath. Your lord would tap your shoulders with a sword and speak the words that changed your legal status forever. You weren't just a warrior now. You were part of a brotherhood that stretched back to Charlemagne. You had a code: honor, courage, loyalty to your lord, protection of the weak. These weren't just ideals, they defined your identity. The knighting ceremony was sacred to these men. It marked the moment when years of suffering and sacrifice meant something. You'd receive your sword, often blessed by a priest, and your spurs, the symbols of knighthood. You'd swear oaths before God and your peers. You'd promise to uphold justice, defend the faith, serve your lord unto death. And you meant it. This wasn't performative. These oaths shaped how knights saw themselves in the world. Your armor was your second skin. A full suit of plate armor in 1450 was a masterpiece of engineering. articulated joints at the elbows, knees, and shoulders that allowed surprising mobility, a breastplate curved to deflect sword blows and lance strikes, a helmet with a visor that could withstand direct hits. This armor could stop any hand weapon of the medieval period. Swords bounced off it. Arrows couldn't penetrate it at range. Even a mace strike, while it might concuss you, wouldn't breach the steel. The armor was custom fitted to your body. An armorer would take dozens of measurements, create a full suit that distributed weight across your frame. Good armor didn't restrict movement as much as people think. Knights could mount horses, fight on foot, even do acrobatics in full plate. But it was heavy, usually 50 to 60 pounds, and wearing it for hours was exhausting. Your neck muscles would burn from supporting the helmet. Your shoulders would ache from the weight of the pauldrons. You'd be drenched in sweat within an hour. And it cost a fortune. A suit of quality plate armor could cost as much as a small estate. We're talking about the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in modern currency. Knights would pass their armor down through generations, have it repaired, modified, improved. It was an investment that said, I am untouchable on the battlefield. Some knights commissioned armor from the masters, Milan, Augsburg, Greenwich. These suits were works of art, etched with designs, fitted with such precision that they seemed to move like cloth. Owning Milan armor was like driving a Ferrari today. It announced your status, your wealth, your seriousness about your profession. Combat was intimate and personal. When two knights met in battle, there was a ritual to it. You'd charge with lances first. The impact was devastating. Lances would shatter. Men would be thrown from horses. If you survived that, you'd draw your sword. You'd circle, probe for weaknesses, try to find gaps in the armor. The armpits, the backs of the knees, the visor slits. Killing a knight in full plate was difficult, which is why most knights captured in battle were held for ransom rather than killed. You were worth more alive. Ransom was a huge part of knightly economics. Capturing an enemy noble could set you up for life. You'd negotiate the ransom price, usually 1 year's income from the captive's estates. While waiting for payment, you'd treat your prisoner well. They were valuable merchandise. This system made warfare less lethal for the nobility. You had an incentive to capture, not kill. Battle was dangerous, but it wasn't suicidal. Knights also fought in judicial combat, trial by battle where disputes were settled through single combat. If someone accused you of a crime, you could demand trial by combat. The belief was that God would ensure the righteous warrior won. These weren't necessarily fights to the death, but they were brutal. Two men in full armor, hammering at each other with swords, maces, and war hammers, until one yielded or couldn't continue. This was the world Renaissance knights grew up in. This was what they trained for. This was what their fathers and grandfathers had done. Warfare was predictable. The technology hadn't changed significantly in centuries. Tactics were understood. If you followed the code, trained properly, maintained your equipment, and fought with courage, you'd probably survive. You might even prosper. And then everything changed. Gunpowder wasn't new in the Renaissance. The Chinese had invented it centuries earlier, and by the 1300s, Europeans had crude cannons. But these early firearms were unreliable, slow to load, and not particularly effective against armor. Knights had seen them and dismissed them as toys, loud, smoky toys that scared horses but didn't kill trained warriors. Early cannons were siege weapons. They could break down castle walls, but on the battlefield they were nearly useless. They took forever to position, had terrible accuracy, and were as likely to explode and kill their own crews as to hit the enemy. Knights looked at these primitive weapons and laughed. Nothing would replace the trained warrior on horseback. They were catastrophically wrong. The matchlock arquebus appeared in the late 1400s, and it changed warfare forever. It was a simple weapon, a metal barrel, a wooden stock, a trigger mechanism that lowered a burning match cord into gunpowder. It took weeks, not years, to train someone to use it effectively. It didn't require a lifetime of physical conditioning. A 15-year-old peasant with an arquebus could kill a knight who'd trained for 2 decades. The matchlock worked through a simple mechanism. You'd pour gunpowder down the barrel, drop in a lead ball, ram it down with a rod. You'd prime the firing pan with finer powder, light your match cord, and when ready to fire, you'd pull the trigger. The match would lower into the pan, ignite the powder, and the flash would travel through a touch hole into the barrel, igniting the main charge and launching the ball. It was slow. Loading took at least a minute, often longer. It was unreliable. Rain could soak your powder, wind could blow out your match, the mechanism could fail. It was inaccurate beyond about 50 yards. But none of that mattered because of one terrifying fact. It worked. And here's what terrified knights. Armor didn't matter anymore. Early bullets couldn't always penetrate plate armor at long range, but they didn't have to. At close range, 50 yards or less, a bullet would punch through even the finest Milan-forged steel. Knights started seeing things they'd never seen before. Breastplates with fist-sized holes. Helmets crumpled inward. Men who died without a scratch on them because the impact had pulverized their organs through the armor. The physics were brutal. A musket ball carried enormous kinetic energy. Even if it didn't penetrate, the impact could break ribs, cause internal bleeding, knock you unconscious. Knights who survived direct hits often died hours later, from internal injuries they didn't even know they had. The blunt force trauma was devastating. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine training your whole life for one-on-one combat. You know how to read your opponent, how to counter their moves, how to exploit their weaknesses, and then someone you can't even see clearly through the smoke shoots you. There's no honor in it. No test of skill, no chance to surrender, just a crack, a punch to your chest, and you're drowning in your own blood inside your helmet. Knights described the experience of being shot as utterly alien. You'd hear the sound, loud, sharp, like thunder. Then the impact. Some said it felt like being kicked by a horse. Others said they didn't feel anything at first, just noticed blood. The wound was hot, burning. If the ball penetrated, you'd feel it tearing through flesh, grinding against bone, and there was nothing you could do. No skill could prevent it. No courage could stop it. You were at the mercy of chance and powder. Knights tried to adapt. Armor got thicker, especially around the chest. By the early 1500s, some knights wore breastplates tested to be proofed against bullets, literally shot at during manufacture to verify they could stop musket fire. These proof marks were stamped into the armor as certification. But thicker armor meant more weight, which meant slower movement, which made you an easier target. Some knights started wearing armor only on the front of their bodies, gambling that they wouldn't turn their backs to the enemy. Others added reinforcement plates, turning themselves into walking fortresses that could barely move. The weight became prohibitive. Knights were wearing 70, 80, even 90 pounds of steel. You needed assistance to mount your horse. Once mounted, you were committed. Dismounting quickly was nearly impossible. If your horse died under you, you were on the ground in armor so heavy you could barely stand, let alone fight. You became a target. But the real problem wasn't just the weapons themselves. It was economics. A knight represented an enormous investment of time and money. 20 years of training, expensive equipment, a war horse that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. When a knight died, you lost all of that. An arquebusier, you could train 100 of them for the cost of one night. If 10 of them died, you'd barely notice. The math was brutal and undeniable. Commanders started doing the calculations. For the cost of maintaining 10 knights, you could field 200 arquebusiers. Those 200 guns could deliver devastating firepower. They could hold defensive positions, break cavalry charges, suppress enemy formations. Yes, they were individually less impressive than knights, but warfare wasn't about individual impressiveness anymore. It was about efficiency, volume of fire, tactical flexibility. The war horses themselves became liabilities. Horses were terrified of gunfire. The sound, the smoke, the smell. It panicked them. A knight on a terrified horse was useless. You couldn't control your mount, couldn't execute charges, couldn't maneuver. You were just sitting on top of 1,000 pounds of scared animal that wanted to run away. Knights spent hours trying to desensitize their horses to gunfire, but it rarely worked completely. Let's talk about specific battles where this new reality became impossible to ignore. The Battle of Cerignola in 1503 is a good starting point. Spanish forces under Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba faced a French army that included some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. French knights, confident in their superiority, charged the Spanish positions. The Spanish had dug trenches and positioned their arquebusiers behind earthworks. As the French knights thundered forward, the Spanish opened fire, not a single volley, continuous rolling fire as arquebusiers rotated positions. The French charge disintegrated. Horses went down screaming, riders were thrown. The entire formation collapsed. The French lost thousands. The Spanish lost barely 100. Witnesses described the scene as apocalyptic. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see 50 feet. The sound was continuous, like endless thunder. French knights charging through it described feeling like they were riding into hell. Horses stumbled over bodies. Riders lost sight of their comrades. The formation that should have been an unstoppable wedge became a confused mob. And the bullets kept coming. This should have been a wake-up call. It wasn't. French knights convinced themselves Cerignola was a fluke. Bad terrain, poor leadership, bad luck. They'd do better next time. So, at the Battle of Ravenna in 1512, they tried again. Same result. Spanish arquebusiers slaughtered French cavalry. Knights watched their friends die in ways that made no sense to them. Men who'd survived dozens of melees, who'd won tournaments, who were legends in their own right, killed by commoners they'd never even reached. At Ravenna, the French cavalry did manage to close with Spanish positions in some areas. But even when they succeeded, the cost was horrific. Knights rode through withering fire, watching their comrades fall. And by the time they reached enemy lines, their formations were shattered and their numbers decimated. The few who made it through were immediately surrounded by pike formations and hacked to pieces. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 was the death knell. Francis I of France led a massive army against Holy Roman Emperor Charles. Francis had the finest knights in Europe, and he was supremely confident. The battle turned into chaos. Artillery, arquebusiers, pike formations all mixed together in brutal close combat. Francis himself led a cavalry charge, trying to turn the tide through sheer courage and skill. He was surrounded by Spanish arquebusiers and Italian soldiers. His horse was shot out from under him. His armor was battered by bullets and pike strikes. He was captured, humiliated, and France lost the battle decisively. A king, a knight of knights, brought down not by a worthy opponent in single combat, but by a mob of common soldiers with guns. Francis wrote about the experience later. He described the humiliation of being tackled to the ground by common soldiers, of having his armor stripped off piece by piece while he was helpless, of being treated like captured prey rather than a noble warrior. For him, this was worse than the physical danger. The social order had inverted. The people he'd been taught were beneath him, had defeated him. After Pavia, the illusion was shattered. Knights could no longer pretend they were the dominant force on European battlefields. But accepting this reality and adapting to it were two different things. Some knights tried to become masters of the new warfare. They learned to use firearms themselves. They studied tactics that combined cavalry charges with gunfire support. They accepted that the days of pure mounted combat were over and that survival meant evolution. These knights often became military commanders, using their training and experience to lead mixed armies of pike, shot, and cavalry. These adaptive knights were controversial among their peers. Traditional knights saw them as traitors to their class, as men who'd abandoned honor for effectiveness. There were bitter arguments in castles and courts across Europe. Should knights embrace these cowardly new weapons, or should they maintain their principles, even if it meant defeat? Some innovators experimented with cavalry armed with wheel-lock pistols. These were expensive firearms that didn't require match cords, making them usable on horseback. The caracole tactic emerged. Cavalry would ride up to enemy formations, fire their pistols, then wheel away to reload while the next rank advanced. It was effective, but it wasn't knightly. There was no shock charge, no glorious melee, just riding up, shooting, and retreating. Many knights felt this was disgraceful, but many knights refused to adapt. To them, using a gun was dishonorable. It was the weapon of cowards. Real warriors fought face to face, where courage and skill mattered. Pointing a gun at someone and pulling a trigger wasn't combat, it was murder. These knights clung to the old ways, kept training in traditional methods, kept believing that honor and bravery would triumph over technology. This wasn't just stubbornness. For these men, their entire identity was built on the idea that martial excellence and moral virtue were connected. Knights were superior warriors because they were noble, honorable, virtuous. To adopt the tactics of commoners was to admit that nobility meant nothing, that honor was irrelevant, that the entire social hierarchy they'd been raised to believe in was arbitrary. They died, not all at once, but steadily, in battles across Europe, at Marignano, at Baccaca, in dozens of smaller engagements that history doesn't remember. Each time, knights charged bravely, and each time, gunfire cut them down. The survivors told horror stories. They described riding through smoke so thick they couldn't see, hearing bullets whine past their heads, feeling the impacts as comrades next to them were hit. They described the randomness. The best knight in the unit killed instantly, the worst survivor untouched. There was no pattern, no way to predict who would live and who would die. Skill didn't matter, only luck. The tournaments changed too. In the medieval period, tournaments were training for war. They were brutal, sometimes lethal events, where knights tested themselves against peers. By the mid-1500s, they'd become pageantry. Elaborate costumes, blunted weapons, strict rules to prevent serious injury. Knights performed for crowds, reenacting the glory days that were already gone. It was like watching a living funeral for an entire way of life. Tournaments in the Renaissance became spectacles. Knights wore increasingly ornate armor, decorated with gold leaf and elaborate engravings. The fighting became stylized, almost choreographed. Points were awarded for technique, not effectiveness. It was beautiful, impressive, and completely divorced from military reality. Knights jousted and dueled while, on real battlefields, their peers were being massacred by gunfire. Some knights made fortunes on the tournament circuit, traveling from court to court, performing for nobles who paid well to see demonstrations of the old ways. These tournament champions were celebrities, but everyone knew they were entertainers, not warriors. A few tried to transition to real warfare and were killed almost immediately. Tournaments and battles had nothing to do with each other anymore. Daily life for a Renaissance knight became increasingly disconnected from military reality. You'd still maintain your armor, still practice your sword work, still participate in tournaments. But everyone knew these skills were becoming obsolete. It was like being a master Fletcher in the age of gunpowder. Technically impressive, but functionally useless. Knights who owned estates spent more time managing land than training for war. They'd oversee harvests, collect taxes, mediate disputes between peasants. This was always part of knightly duty, but it had been secondary to their military role. Now it became primary. You were a landlord who happened to own armor, not a warrior who happened to own land. Knights found other roles. They became diplomats, using their education and noble status. They became administrators, managing estates and serving in royal courts. They became ceremonial guards, where their impressive appearance mattered more than their combat effectiveness. The title of knight became more about social status than military function. Royal courts across Europe had positions for knights, bodyguards, advisors, ceremonial roles in state functions. These positions paid well and required no actual fighting. Many knights transitioned into these roles gratefully. Others found them humiliating, feeling like they'd been reduced to decorations, living props in someone else's political theater. Some knights joined the new standing armies that were replacing feudal levies. But they weren't knights anymore, not really. They were cavalry officers, commanding units of pistol-armed horsemen who fought very differently from the lance and sword warriors of old. They wore lighter armor, used firearms themselves, and employed hit-and-run tactics rather than frontal charges. Effective? Yes. Knightly? Not by any medieval definition. The transition was psychologically difficult. You'd spent 20 years learning to fight in one specific way, and now you had to relearn everything. The tactics were different, the equipment was different, the entire philosophy of warfare was different. Some knights managed it. Many couldn't or wouldn't, and they found themselves unemployed, their expensive training worthless. The psychological toll was severe. Imagine dedicating your entire life to a profession, only to watch it become irrelevant before your eyes. Knights had built their identities around being the elite warriors of European society. They'd internalized the codes of chivalry, the ideals of martial honor. And now, they were being told that none of it mattered anymore, that a peasant with 3 weeks of training was more valuable than they were. Depression was common among Renaissance knights. So was alcoholism. Some knights simply gave up, stopped training, let themselves decline. They'd sit in their castles, drink wine, and tell stories about the old days to anyone who'd listen. Their sons often refused to become knights, choosing different professions, breaking centuries of family tradition. Some knights became bitter. They blamed the changing world, railed against the cowardice of modern warfare, longed for a return to the old ways. Others fell into depression, feeling that their lives had been wasted preparing for a world that no longer existed. A few adapted successfully, but they had to accept that they were no longer knights in any traditional sense. They were something new, something that didn't have a name yet. There are letters from this period, knights writing to friends and family that are heartbreaking to read. They talk about feeling useless, about watching younger men with no training achieve military success, about the humiliation of being obsolete in middle age. One knight wrote that he felt like he'd studied Latin his whole life, only to find everyone had switched to a different language. The economic pressure was relentless. Maintaining knightly equipment and lifestyle was expensive, but the opportunities to profit from war were disappearing. In the medieval period, knights could capture enemies for ransom, could loot conquered territories, could expect rewards from their lords for military service. Renaissance warfare didn't work that way. Standing armies were paid salaries, not given opportunities for plunder. Enemy soldiers were killed, not captured. The financial model that had sustained knighthood for centuries collapsed. The ransom system fell apart. Professional soldiers didn't have estates to ransom. They were paid wages, not landed income. Capturing them was pointless. They had nothing to give you. And commanders didn't want prisoners anymore. Prisoners cost money to feed and guard. It was more efficient to kill them or let them go. Many knightly families went bankrupt. They'd invested everything in preparing their sons for military careers that no longer existed. Their armor sat unused. Their war horses grew old in stables. Their ancestral swords became decorations on walls. Some families transitioned into trade or law, abandoning martial traditions entirely. Others clung to their declining status, growing poorer with each generation until their great-grandchildren were knights in name only. The bankruptcy process was humiliating. Knights would sell their armor piece by piece, trying to maintain appearances while their finances collapsed. First, the horse armor would go, then the extra weapons, then finally the suit of plate itself. Selling your armor was like selling your identity. Some knights refused and instead went into debt, borrowing money they'd never repay, clinging to symbols of status they could no longer afford. The social hierarchy shifted. For centuries, knights had been the enforcer class, the people who maintained order through the threat of overwhelming martial superiority. No peasant uprising could succeed against armored cavalry. No merchant could challenge noble authority when that authority was backed by trained warriors who were nearly invincible in combat. But guns changed the equation. 100 commoners with arquebuses could slaughter 100 knights. The threat of violence that had kept the feudal system stable for centuries was suddenly gone. This terrified the nobility. It wasn't just about losing battles, it was about losing control. If commoners could kill knights, what else could they do? The social order seemed less permanent, less divinely ordained. The Renaissance saw increasing unrest, peasant revolts, religious conflicts that tore Europe apart. Knights found themselves fighting not foreign enemies, but their own populations, and they weren't winning. The German Peasants' War of 1524-1525 was particularly shocking. Peasant armies, equipped with firearms and organized into disciplined formations, defeated knightly forces in several battles. Knights who'd spent their lives believing in their natural superiority watched peasants fight effectively, using tactics and weapons that nullified knightly advantages. The revolt was eventually crushed, but the psychological damage was done. Knights could be beaten by commoners. Religion became a refuge for many knights. The knightly orders, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, Knights of Calatrava, shifted focus from military campaigns to religious duties. They became monks who happened to own swords, spending more time in prayer than in training. Some knights genuinely found meaning in this transition. Others simply had nowhere else to go. The church still valued them, even if the world didn't. Joining a military order had always been an option for knights, but in the Renaissance, it became more like retirement. The orders maintained their traditions, their rituals, their sense of being connected to a glorious past. For knights who couldn't adapt to the new military reality, the orders offered community, purpose, and dignity. You were still a knight, still part of something noble, even if you spent more time in chapel than on horseback. The Knights of Malta deserve special mention. They were one of the last groups to maintain genuine military relevance into the late Renaissance. Based on the island of Malta, they fought Ottoman naval forces in the Mediterranean, but even they had to adapt. By the 1550s, Maltese knights were using cannons and firearms extensively. They fought from fortifications, not from horseback. They were still called knights, but their combat style had more in common with sailors and artillerymen than with medieval cavalry. The Great Siege of Malta in 1565 was the knights' last moment of true glory. Ottoman forces besieged the island with overwhelming numbers. The knights held out for months, using every advantage of their fortifications and firepower. They fought bravely, but they fought with cannons, arquebuses, and defensive tactics. When they did engage in close combat, it was desperate fighting in breached walls, not glorious cavalry charges. They won, and Europe celebrated them as heroes. But even their victory proved that the old ways were gone. Literature and art from the period reflect this transitional agony. Miguel de Cervantes published Don Quixote in 1605, and while it's often read as comedy, it's also a tragedy about a man who can't accept that his world is gone. Don Quixote sees himself as a knight-errant, but everyone else sees a delusional old man in outdated armor. Cervantes himself had been a soldier, had fought at the Battle of Lepanto, had seen the old ways dying. Don Quixote wasn't just satire, it was elegy. Don Quixote attacks windmills because he sees giants. He charges sheep because he sees armies. He treats inns as castles and peasant women as noble ladies. The entire novel is about a man living in a fantasy version of a world that no longer exists, and that was Renaissance knights in microcosm. They kept acting as if the old rules still applied, kept believing in codes and honors that the world had abandoned. Renaissance paintings of knights are telling too. Early Renaissance art shows knights as heroic figures, powerful and noble. But by the late 1500s, the imagery changes. Knights appear in ceremonial contexts, in court settings, in historical scenes. They're painted as relics, not as active participants in contemporary warfare. The message was clear. Knights belong to the past. Portrait paintings showed knights in full armor, posing heroically, hands on sword hilts. But these weren't combat portraits. They were status symbols, ways of claiming connection to a glorious heritage. The armor in these paintings was often decorative, too ornate for actual fighting. It was costume, not equipment. Knights were becoming historical reenactors of their own profession. Some knights left Europe entirely. The Spanish conquistadors were largely knights and hidalgos, minor nobility who couldn't find opportunity at home. They took their martial training, their sense of honor, and their desperation to the Americas. There, they could fight enemies who didn't have guns, who didn't have steel, who could still be dominated by armored cavalry. It was a last chance to be the kind of warrior they'd been trained to be. Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and many other conquistadors were from the lower nobility. They'd been trained as knights, but had no prospects in Spain. The Americas offered opportunity to use their martial skills in ways that felt familiar. They could charge enemy formations, rely on their armor for protection, engage in personal combat. For a brief period, they could be the kind of warriors they'd dreamed of being. But even in the Americas, the old ways didn't last. The indigenous peoples learned to use firearms, learned to counter cavalry tactics. European diseases did more damage than any sword. And the conquistadors themselves changed, becoming colonizers and administrators rather than warriors. The Age of Exploration wasn't a revival of knighthood. It was just a different stage for its funeral. By the 1540s, Spanish colonial forces in the Americas were using the same mixed pike and shot tactics as European armies. Native allies armed with guns were often more effective than Spanish cavalry. The brief window where knights could fight in traditional ways closed quickly. Even fleeing to a new world couldn't stop the changes. By 1600, European warfare had fundamentally transformed. Armies were built around pike and shot formations, dense blocks of pikemen to hold ground, musketeers to deliver firepower. Cavalry still existed, but they were light horsemen or dragoons, not knights. They scouted, harassed, pursued broken formations. They didn't charge into enemy lines expecting to win through shock and valor. The entire tactical doctrine that had defined European warfare for centuries was gone. The Spanish tercio became the dominant formation. Pikemen in the center, arquebusiers on the corners, all moving together in a coordinated mass. This formation could repel cavalry charges and deliver devastating firepower. Individual skill mattered less than discipline and coordination. Soldiers drilled endlessly in formation movements and volley fire. It was professional, efficient, and completely unlike the warrior culture knights had known. Knights didn't disappear overnight, though. The title persisted, but it became ceremonial. Kings still knighted people, but they were knighting administrators, diplomats, artists. Being a knight meant you'd serve the crown, not that you were a warrior. The martial aspect, the entire foundation of what knighthood had originally meant, was stripped away. By 1600, you could be knighted for writing a good poem, managing finances well, or negotiating a successful treaty. Warriors who'd never worn armor received knighthoods. The title had completely detached from its military origins. For old knights who remembered when the honor meant something specific, this was another indignity, another sign that their world had ended. Some old knights lived long enough to see this complete transformation. Imagine being 70 years old in 1580, having been knighted in 1530. You'd have lived through the entire collapse of your profession. You'd remember when knights were feared and respected, when battles were decided by cavalry charges, when your armor made you nearly invincible. And now you'd watch young men being knighted who'd never held a lance, who'd never trained for war, who wore their spurs as decorations rather than tools. The world had moved on without asking your permission. These old knights became living museums. Young people would visit them to hear stories about the old days. They'd show off their armor, demonstrate sword techniques, talk about tournaments and battles. But they were relics. Everyone knew the world they described was gone. Listening to them was like listening to someone speak a dead language. Interesting as history, but irrelevant to contemporary life. The castles changed too. Medieval castles were military installations designed to withstand siege and serve as bases for armored cavalry. Renaissance fortifications looked completely different. Star forts with low walls and angular bastions designed to deflect cannon fire. Wide fields of fire for artillery. No tall towers that could be bombarded into rubble. These weren't homes for knights. They were military installations designed by engineers, not warriors. The Trace Italian style of fortification dominated by the mid-1500s. These forts were geometric, mathematical, designed to provide overlapping fields of fire for artillery and arquebuses. They were incredibly effective, but they had no romantic appeal. No soaring towers, no dramatic battlements. Just low, angular walls designed for function over form. Knights who owned castles often couldn't afford to modernize them. Medieval fortifications were useless against Renaissance artillery, but rebuilding in the new style was staggeringly expensive. So they lived in obsolete castles that could be reduced to rubble in hours by a competent artillery crew. Their homes became symbols of their own irrelevance. Some castles were abandoned entirely. Why maintain a fortress that couldn't withstand modern siege? Knights moved into manor houses, comfortable but not defensible. The shift was symbolic. Knights were no longer military assets that needed to be protected behind walls. They were just wealthy landowners, no different from merchants or lawyers. The training methods that had produced knights for centuries became historical curiosities. The martial treatises, the fighting techniques, the elaborate rituals of knightly combat, all were preserved in books, but no longer actively practiced except as historical study. By the early 1600s, fencing masters were teaching lighter, faster sword techniques designed for dueling and self-defense, not for fighting in armor. The heavy long swords and war lances gathered dust. Fencing became an art form. Masters like Ridolfo Capoferro and Salvator Fabris wrote treatises on rapier combat. These were elegant weapons, nothing like the heavy war swords of medieval knights. Dueling culture emerged among the nobility, but it bore little resemblance to knightly combat. Duels were about personal honor, not military effectiveness. They were quick, lethal encounters between unarmored men, not the grinding melees of armored warriors that knights had trained for. Old knights looked at rapier fencing with contempt. To them, it was dancing, not fighting. Real combat was brutal, exhausting, wearing 60 pounds of steel while trying to beat your opponent into submission. Rapier dueling was for peacocks who'd never faced real danger, but the young nobility loved it. It was fashionable, sophisticated, and actually relevant to their lives. Knights were becoming historical curiosities in their own lifetimes. Some aspects of knightly culture survived in transmuted form. The concept of the gentleman warrior, the officer who led through example rather than rank alone, the idea that military leadership required personal courage. These echoes of chivalry persisted. Modern military officer culture still reflects some knightly values, but it's a pale shadow, stripped of the mysticism and ritual that made knights a distinct warrior caste. The officer class that emerged in the 1600s inherited some knightly traditions. Officers were expected to be brave, to lead from the front, to maintain honor. But they were also expected to understand tactics, logistics, and the technical details of firearms and artillery. The romantic idealism of knighthood was tempered by practical professionalism. Officers were administrators who occasionally fought, not warriors who occasionally administered. The last knights knew what was happening. They weren't blind. They watched their relevance drain away with each passing year, with each technological advance, with each battle where gunpowder proved decisive. Some of them wrote about it, leaving bitter letters and journals documenting their sense of loss. Others simply stopped talking about it, performing their duties in silence, maintaining traditions they knew were dying. One knight, writing in the 1570s, described feeling like a ghost. He said he'd walk through his castle, seeing his armor on display, his weapons mounted on walls, trophies from tournaments and battles. But they felt like they belonged to someone else, some other man from some other time. He was still alive, but the person he'd been trained to be was dead. There are estate inventories from this period that are revealing. Knights who died in the late 1500s often left massive collections of outdated military equipment. Full suits of armor, dozens of weapons, horse armor gathering dust in stables. Their heirs would sell most of it for scrap metal. The investment of generations melted down to make tools and building materials. There's something profoundly tragic about the Renaissance knight. These weren't foolish people or anachronistic relics clinging to stupidity. They were products of a system that had worked for centuries, that had been rational and effective for their entire lives and for generations before them. And then the world changed faster than they could adapt. Think about how that would feel. Everything you know, everything you've trained for, everything that gives your life meaning, rendered obsolete not by your own failure, but by circumstances beyond your control. You didn't get worse. The world just moved past you. That's the Renaissance knight's story. Modern people face similar experiences. Industries collapse. Technologies make professions obsolete. The world changes in ways that make your skills irrelevant. But few professions had the identity component that knighthood had. Knights weren't just doing a job. They were living out a sacred calling, embodying ideals that were supposed to be eternal. When those ideals became obsolete, it wasn't just unemployment, it was existential collapse. By the early 1600s, the transformation was complete. Knights existed as titles and honors, but not as a military force. The 30 Years' War, which started in 1618, was fought by professional armies using pike, shot, and artillery. Cavalry still played a role, but they were pistol-armed cavalrymen who fought in formations, not individual knights seeking glory. The age of the knight was definitively over. The 30 Years' War was one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. Professional armies marched across the continent, devastating everything in their path. But there was nothing chivalrous about it. Mercenaries fought for whoever paid them. Civilians were massacred. Cities were sacked. The old knightly codes, protection of the weak, honor in combat, mercy to the defeated, were completely absent. Some knights fought in the 30 Years' War, but they were officers in these professional armies, not knights in any meaningful sense. They commanded regiments of musketeers and pikemen. They coordinated artillery barrages. They planned sieges using mathematical calculations. Their knightly training was largely irrelevant to their actual duties. The few times cavalry charges were attempted in the 30 Years' War, they usually failed catastrophically. Disciplined infantry formations, bristling with pikes and muskets, could stop cavalry cold. The dramatic charges that had decided medieval battles became suicide missions. Commanders learned to use cavalry for reconnaissance, screening, and pursuit. Support roles, not decisive actions. So what was it like being a knight in the Renaissance? It was like being the last speaker of a dying language. It was watching everything you'd been taught to value become worthless. It was training for a type of warfare that no longer existed. It was maintaining traditions that had lost their purpose. It was being living proof that skill, courage, and honor couldn't stop technological change. Knights had believed that their superiority was moral as well as martial. They were better warriors because they were better people. more disciplined, more virtuous, more noble. The rise of gunpowder warfare destroyed that belief. A peasant with basic training could kill the finest knight. Moral superiority didn't matter. Noble bloodlines didn't matter. Decades of training didn't matter. Only technology mattered. Some Renaissance knights adapted and found new purposes. They became something else, something beyond the old categories. But most of them lived in an awkward transitional period, no longer medieval but not yet modern, trying to maintain identities that the world no longer recognized or valued. The successful adapters often came from younger generations who'd grown up seeing the changes. They didn't have the deep emotional investment in the old ways. They could treat knightly skills as one tool among many, not as the foundation of their identity. These men became the military innovators of the early modern period, creating the professional armies that would dominate European warfare for the next 2 centuries. But for the knights who'd been raised before the changes, who'd built their entire self-concept around being medieval warriors, adaptation was nearly impossible. You can't easily abandon beliefs that were literally beaten into you as a child. That defined every aspect of your training, that connected you to centuries of tradition. These men clung to the old ways even as the world moved on, and most of them died bitter, feeling betrayed by history. The Renaissance knight stands at one of history's great dividing lines, the moment when individual martial prowess stopped being the decisive factor in warfare. Before them, brave, skilled warriors could change battles. After them, training, equipment, and tactics mattered more than any individual. They were the last generation for whom personal heroism could, theoretically, turn the tide of battle. And they watched that possibility die. This transformation would happen again in history. World War I made cavalry obsolete in much the same way. Officers who'd trained for mounted warfare found themselves in trenches, their expensive educations worthless. The atomic bomb made conventional military strength less relevant. Each technological revolution creates casualties beyond the people who die. It destroys entire ways of life, entire professional identities. Their story is a reminder that no system lasts forever, no matter how dominant it seems. For 500 years, knights were the apex of European military power. And then, in barely a century, they were gone. Not because they became less brave or less skilled, but because the world found more efficient ways to kill people. The decline wasn't even particularly long in historical terms. A knight born in 1450 would have grown up in a world where knighthood was still prestigious and relevant. By the time he died in 1530, everything had changed. One lifetime. That's all it took for an institution that had lasted half a millennium to become obsolete. That's the brutal truth of the Renaissance knight. They didn't lose because they failed. They lost because history moved on without them. They trained harder, fought bravor, and maintained higher standards than the men who replaced them. None of it mattered. A peasant with a gun beat a knight with 20 years of training. That's the reality they had to face every day. And perhaps the cruelest part was that they could see it happening. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe, it was a slow decline, stretching across decades. Each year brought new evidence that the old ways were dying. Each battle proved firearms more decisive. Each tournament felt more like a museum exhibit. Knights watched their profession die in slow motion, powerless to stop it. Some tried to fight back politically. They lobbied rulers to ban firearms, arguing that guns were unchivalrous, that they gave unfair advantages to commoners, that they would destroy the social order. Some rulers listened, but it was pointless. You can't ban military technology when your enemies are using it. The kingdoms that clung to knights, while their rivals built gunpowder armies, simply lost wars until they changed course. There were attempts to find compromise positions. Maybe knights could use firearms, but only in certain circumstances. Maybe they could maintain their traditional role in ceremonial contexts while adopting new methods for actual warfare. These compromises satisfied no one. Traditional knights saw them as betrayal, while military pragmatists saw them as pointless half measures. The middle ground collapsed, leaving only modernizers and dinosaurs. The last true knights, the men who tried to fight in the old way until the very end, left almost no historical record. Most of them died in obscure battles, their names forgotten. They weren't famous tournament champions or wealthy nobles. They were minor knights who dedicated their lives to a profession that became worthless. History moved on without recording their struggles, their frustrations, their sense of betrayal. But their absence in the historical record tells its own story. When knights were important, chroniclers wrote about them extensively. Individual knights were named, their deeds recorded, their heraldry described. By 1600, historical accounts barely mention knights, except as background details. They'd become so irrelevant that historians didn't bother tracking them. It's like they faded from history while still alive. So when you think about what it was like being a knight in the Renaissance, think about that fading. Think about being increasingly invisible in your own world. Think about maintaining skills no one valued, traditions no one respected, codes no one followed. Think about watching younger generations dismiss everything you'd built your life around as old-fashioned foolishness. Think about the loneliness of it. Your fellow knights were dying or adapting, becoming something else. The brotherhood you'd sworn oaths to was dissolving. The shared identity that had connected you to men across Europe, across centuries, was evaporating. You were part of the last generation of something ancient, watching it end, unable to pass it on, because there was no one left to receive it. Renaissance knights lived through one of history's great transitions: the birth of modern warfare, the death of the medieval world, the end of an era when individual warriors could be decisive. They were casualties of progress, collateral damage in humanity's endless quest for more efficient ways to wage war. Their story deserves to be remembered, not because they were heroes or villains, but because they were human. They faced a challenge that every generation eventually faces. The world changes, and you must change with it or be left behind. Some adapted, many couldn't. All of them suffered through the transition, watching their certainties crumble, their training become obsolete, their identity become historical curiosity. That's what being a knight in the Renaissance was really like. It was living through the apocalypse of your entire way of life, watching the world you understood end, and trying to maintain dignity and purpose while everything you'd been taught to believe in proved false. It was training for a war that would never come, preparing for a world that no longer existed, clinging to honor in an age that had moved beyond it. And perhaps, in that struggle, there's something universal. The Renaissance knight, standing in his outdated armor, watching peasants with guns reshape the world, that's the human condition. We're all eventually standing in obsolete armor, watching the world change into something we no longer recognize, trying to maintain meaning while everything we knew becomes history.